So thank you for the opportunity to speak today on a favorite topic for me, one of the things that motivated me to get into geriatrics, in fact. So I have a couple of disclosures. The clinical frailty scale, if you want to use it, we ask you to sign a form saying you won't change or commercialize it, but we put everything else out there free. I founded this company in Ontario trying to charge for the use of the clinical frailty scale. That's not right. If someone writes to you about the charge for it, you can just send them to the Dal Industry Liaison Office, and all the Frailty Index stuff is open access. So what is frailty? So frailty is a multiply determined state of risk, and it is associated with age, and it becomes more common as we get older. In the literature in general, you can view it as a state or as a syndrome. I'm kind of the state guy, but I'm Canadian, married to both sides. I'll talk about them both. But in a large amount of work spanning clinical population and basic science studies, one point is clear: all the frailty instruments that are out there count deficits, and we have to get to grips with what those are if we're going to understand what this is. This is also, from my standpoint, a very liberating insight, because people develop frailty instruments for purposes that are important to them, and so they count things that are important to them, and that's good. And I think that a lot of the energy about this instrument, not that one, and so on, we can sort of be calm and try and think of what is the point of the instrument that we're looking at. So what is a health deficit? Well, it's something that is detectable. In the first instance, we've been talking about things that are clinically detectable when damage goes unremoved or unrepaired. So obviously the extent to which an individual is frail is going to reflect the damage to which they've been exposed, as well as what their intrinsic repair capability is, because most of the damage to which we've been exposed comes from the environment in the form of oxygen and food and metabolism and stuff like that. And that's a really important point too. It also means that frailty is about aging, right? They are intrinsically bound up, and we need to come back to that too. But the thing about frail older adults is that they're complex. They have multiple interacting medical and social problems, and they challenge a healthcare system which has succeeded in solving problems one at a time. We've succeeded by knowing more and more and more about particular problems. And if you've only got that one problem, you should go to the ologist who fixes that, who lives for it, who thinks this is the best thing going. But that ologist's skills are irrelevant to most people by definition. So we need a big change in the way we think about how we're training people to equip them for healthcare in terms of the skills they need. And it's not that people start as really good generalists and then they become the subspecialized ologist after that. Generalism is a learned skill, and it takes some time to acquire and understand what goes on, and we ignore this at our peril. And the final thing at our peril is that a lot of the remedies sound like common sense. People get deluded into the fact that, well, I know a frail person when I see one. Turns out it's tough. It turns out that people think they're doing a lot of things that we ask them to do, but they're not. So we have to figure out how we're going to work through this. I found the mathematics has been a worthwhile thing. You get kind of tarted up with a little bit of differential equation here and there, and everyone goes, oh my God. And you say, don't worry, I can boil it all down for you. But still, the burden of common sense, the challenge of supposed common sense, is an attitude that we're going to have to deal with to make headway here. So here are data from Statistics Canada, still exists. And this is a cohort from 1900, 1901, followed through till they're all dead now. And you can see that in those days, the mortality rate was very high. It dropped precipitously, then it started to go up again. It sort of shot up here. This is testosterone toxicity for the most part. And then it went up on a log scale. It went up like that with a very tight correlation. And the common sense account of that is the older people get, the more likely they are to die, which at least is not counterintuitive. But here's the trick. People age at different rates. So here's an 80-year-old man, And here's an 80-year-old man, the latter being the Canadian marathoner Ed Whitlock, crossing the Toronto Marathon at a sub 3:30. Not bad for an old guy. And so people sometimes say, well, we should just get everyone to run and eat yogurt and wear Birkenstocks and we'd all live forever. But it turns out that's not so. So here are data from Drosophila. And if you look, so here's the wild types. And you can have this gene or that one. If you look, the wee flies that live well, they start off living well right at the start. And the flies who die sooner. But look, at the end, there's a great deal of variability in the risk of death for flies of the same age. Frailty is a feature of complexity, is baked in, even to little tiny flies. So the idea that we're going to somehow get a prevention strategy which will make this go away is a comforting thought. And there's no doubt that we should exercise and wear Birkenstocks and eat yogurt and stuff. But that won't fix the problem. So we have to get to grips with this because the problem of aging, as the population ages, we must deal with this. There's no getting around it. It is baked in. So the notion of frailty, where the idea came from, this is a matter of fact. Some people dispute, well, yeah, frail, everyone's got their own view. Well, yeah, we all have our own view, but here's where we came from. The term was used in the modern sense in 1979 to get to grips with this problem, which was that there appeared to be a plateau in late life mortality. And these were actuaries who looked at this, and they tried to figure out how to make it work, and they're very sophisticated statistical sorts, and they said, here, we'll put a fudge factor in, and we'll make the model fit with that. And that thing they called frailty, that's where the term came from. And they're still at it. And this is a compelling issue, and that very clever people of great goodwill and insight are still trying to understand the statistical basis of frailty. So we come from a proud heritage, but clinically we don't think about frailty as a fixed lifelong trait. We think about it as an acquired state. And from that standpoint, there's two ways to operationalize it. Many of you will know there's one way in which everything is very highly specified. It's going to be grip strength and this and this and this. And then there's our approach, which says, count enough stuff, count enough things that are wrong with people, and then divide it by the number of things that you counted, and you'll come up with a thing called the frailty index. And we say, as long as the thing you're going to count is bad for you and increases with age, count it. And you have access to data on it, and the data are true, count that. And count as many things as you can get your hands on, which is different from the traditional statistical approach, right? I've got 100 things here, I can boil it down to 2. Well, it turns out, no, you can't. You can do it in a way that will satisfy the statistical criteria, but you actually won't get to grips with the clinical phenomenon in front of you. And in the era of the electronic health record, there's no point in us tying ourselves up in data reduction strategies that we don't have to have, particularly when we're throwing out information as we go. So the way in which this works is that many problems become more common with age. And that's just a fact. And we call them challenges, we can call them opportunities and so on, but bad things happen and they accumulate with age. The way in which they accumulate varies by the condition. And actually the shapes of these ways of accumulation is informative in and of itself. There's a ton of things to know. That's why the clever demographers and such are still spending time working on this. But in general, what happens is that it increases with age. So all we've done, what we say is, count the number of things that you can get in front of you that are important for you, right? So if you're in China, for example, if you're in the south of China, in Guangzhou, and you don't count malaria and things that go with that, your frailty index will be incomplete. If you come to Halifax and count malaria, you'll have one that is largely irrelevant for most of the information which is there. So you have to have things which work in your context. If you're going to look at frailty and intellectual disability, as I saw one of the posters last night, you'll count things differently than you would if you're going to look at frailty in older golfers. Well, maybe. So you take the number of things that you've counted, divide by the number of things that you counted, that will give you a number which is the frailty index. It'll go between 0 if you had nothing wrong, and so say, I gave the example here, if you counted 50 things, you found someone had 10 things wrong, 10 divided by 50 is 0.2, and that's the number of things that you would count. And that's what the value of the frailty index would be for that person. And if they had all 50 things wrong, well, it turns out they can't, which is a fact we'll come back to. But the deficits accumulate with age. The dots around that line are the mean value of the frailty index for different studies expressed on a log scale. This is ancient data now from 2005. And then it was around 33,000 people. The slope is around 3% per year. We've done this many, many, many times since, and now have data on hundreds of thousands, even you'll hear soon millions of people. And the rate is somewhere around 3%. So this gives us a really good insight into understanding the dynamics of age-related deficit accumulation. And what is it with frail people? They accumulate more things. They have more things wrong with them. And this is important because the more things you have wrong with you, the more likely you are to die. Again, another the burden of common sense piece. The mathematics of that statement are actually quite fascinating. But what it boils down to is when people have sufficiently high number of things wrong with them, their mortality is very low regardless. Their mortality is very high when they have a large number of things wrong with them. Their mortality is very high no matter what. And that's in free-ranging older adults. Take that person, make them sick, and you've got to take into account the chance of them surviving. So here's what I've said so far. I've said that frailty is an increase in risk compared with other people the same age, right? We've established that you shouldn't be talking about age with respect to risk because everyone as they get older is more likely to die. So to talk about frailty, you need to talk about variability in the risk of people of the same age. And risk varies because people accumulate health deficits at a different rate. And at any age, the person with the most number of things wrong with them is the one most likely to die. And that's the basis of frailty. So again, I come back to the idea of does it matter which things we count? I made the assertion that it doesn't really, and here's some empirical data along those lines from Olga Teo, who's from our group, who's here. And here's the Edmonton Frailty Scale. Here's how things increase with age there. There's a frailty index that we had. You can see that these slopes are about the same. Here's the frailty phenotype. It has an attenuated increase in deficits, not because there's anything wrong with the 5 things they count. It's just that you have to count more than 5 things to get the robustness of the complexity to be understood. What does start to matter is when we take these nice, beautiful, continuous data and chop them into 2, frail, not frail. And then what we find is that the cut points vary, and people say, well, this is all chaos because the frailty prevalence varies. Frailty prevalence varies if you insist on dichotomizing a continuous variable, which we really know you shouldn't do. It's a little bit harder to think of it otherwise, but this is, of the many things we have to face up to, grading frailty should not be the one that stumps us. Other people say, well, no, the only way to deal with this is you got to count the same thing all the time forever. We'll make sure it's done, and so on and so on. So take the frailty phenotype, the easiest one to insist on that for. And here are the 5 things that get counted. It turns out you can't specify the world. And people count or don't count things in varying ways based on what they've got in front of them. And it turns out that, again, a work from Olga Teo, 262 phenotypes she was able to find of the frailty 262 variants of the frailty phenotype she was able to find. And clever and energetic young woman that she is, she looked at the impact of the variability on risk and on prevalence. You can see it's quite high. Whoops, sorry. You can see that there's a lot of variability depending on how exactly you've operationalized that frailty phenotype. So the idea that we're going to have a world committee which will standardize all of it and that'll take care of it, that's not going to work. So again, a part of the challenge that we face is we have to understand that in a complex phenomenon, we have to take into account the complexity. We can't standardize it away. That's a fact. And then you'll hear more shortly and later on today about another idea we've got to get to grips with at the outset when we're talking about frailty instrumentation and measurement is what are we measuring this for? And particularly, are we screening or are we doing an assessment? And obviously, there are different attributes of the 2 instruments. A screening instrument would be a very poor assessment instrument and vice versa. So that's another hurdle that we see. And sometimes I get invited to these things where we have debate about this type versus that type and so on. And there's just a huge amount of underbrush here to clear out. And again, my Canadian instinct to say, well, we're all right. But certainly we're all wrong if we don't specify what it is we're trying to do, what the purpose of the instrument is, and how we understand the local need to be reflected in the expression of frailty, and if we can't get to grips with simple issues such as dichotomization. For me, the most startling thing that I've known about the frailty index that I've learned from this is something which I aim to embrace, but I find troubling, is the notion there's a limit to frailty. So remember at the outset I said with the frailty index, you have nothing wrong with you, count at 50 things, nothing wrong, 0 by 50 is 0. The frailty index, you get nothing wrong is 0. The frailty index, if you have as many things as wrong as you can have, will be 35 or thereabouts. So it'll be roughly 0.7. It turns out everywhere that we've looked, there's a limit to frailty at 0.7. This is a very interesting fact. It's now been demonstrated independently by many, many groups, and the consequences for it are enormous. And we need to get to grips with this, and we need to have the tools that allow us to get to grips with this. And some part of it is going to be complexity science, engineers and mathematicians and folks like that, and some part of it is going to be the clinical phenomena. And we have to have ways for those groups to come together. And presently, as it turns out, a lot of the work we do on the mathematics is too mathematical for CIHR, but trivial to NSERC. So we need to have people who can get to grips with the idea that these questions will require interdisciplinary collaborative practice and study. So here's the thing. Here are data on 6,600 people from China, aged 80 to 99. One of the great things about working in China, you want big numbers? They got the big numbers. So here are the raw data on these 6,600 people. And you can see that the mode is somewhere around 0.15, and that was roughly 1,800 of those people. 2 years afterwards, when they were followed up, you'll see that the area under the curve is much smaller because people at this age in China don't live a long time. But even though the mortality rate was very, very high, the mode didn't change. And it didn't change 2 years after, and it didn't change when the last one was done before they were all dead. But the really important thing is the limit didn't change either. So there appears to be a fixed limit to the number of things that we can tolerate. And interestingly, that appears to accord with a limit in physical systems to the number of things that a physical system can have as one attribute till it changes its state. So there appears to be a lot of information around what's happening here. And it's really important for us as we try to get to grips with what the outcomes of certain interventions might be for older adults. And you can see now if we put it all on a proportionate scale that the distribution stays about the same, and this is informative. And again, as we start to look at the frailty index and its behavior, it's so characteristic that in a short period of time, you can look at a distribution of data and make an inference of how old the people are, where they came from, what's the clinical series, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of characteristicness in there, and we need to be able to bring the right mathematical, engineering, systems biology tools, bioinformatics to bear. And so as important as biostatistics is, that can't be the only skill set that we prioritize for quantitative reasoning around the issue of frailty. So why does frailty matter? Because it's tied up with aging. It starts at a very low level down, right? The fluidity of our movement, I think, betrays to us, makes it hard for us to accept just how incredibly tightly structurally organized we are, what fantastic specimens we are that allow us to do these little movement things effortlessly. But the protein structure that underlies all of that is extremely elegant and extremely tightly coordinated. And with age, little things go wrong with it, and those little things begin to add up. And the basis of that is the basis of aging. And so this is, if you are so inclined and don't know this paper, it was in Cell in June of 2013, and they just went through all the things that happen with aging and all the discrete processes which are there, but they made the point that's not the trick. The trick is that they work together. In fact, there was a very interesting and compelling editorial in Nature last July, which opens with this line: "The problems of old age come as a package." And then it outlines some of the features in the paper in the Cell paper, and then it excoriated researchers in diseases of old age, particularly heart and Alzheimer's, as people acting as though the fact of aging was irrelevant. So we surely, as we get to grips with this, have to understand that the very particular thing we might be interested in needs to be put in a context. And we actually wrote to the folks at Nature and said, the word you're looking for here is frailty. And the problems of old age come in a package. We can actually quantify that package in which come the problems of old age. We made the pitch for a Frailty Index. We also acknowledged, because we're Canadians, there's other ways to approach it, and we gave references for all of that too. But I think this is a very compelling issue for our time, and it's a very interesting scientific issue, and we need not take a backseat to anyone in terms of the depth of science which is required here to really get to grips with this issue. So arising in the context of aging is all these things that go wrong. If we think that in some level every illness is a metaphor, if you only got one thing wrong with you, that metaphor is going to hold to a very high extent. By the time the 11th illness comes in, the metaphor of that illness is not going to hold in the same way. That's a fact. And we have to get to grips with what that means. We have to understand what new set of facts we can bring to bear to allow the management of those people. And we have got to rid ourselves of this terrible attitude that these patients don't belong. Acutely ill, frail, older adult, fell down, can't get up. What do? Brought him to emerge. What happens there? Some snot-nosed 26-year-old resident's going to say, well, I don't know if he belongs here. I'm here to do this. He didn't really faint. I'm not sure. I'm cardiology. The guy didn't faint. It's not up to the patients to get sick on our terms. It's up to us to understand the terms on which these people get sick. And that probably is the biggest attitude shift that we need. And it's an easy way to make that happen. We can go in and say, okay, fine, you're right. You're absolutely right. We're sorry we bothered you. We're going to take that patient and all the resources that you would have spent on that patient to no end, and we're going to put them over in this other nicely resourced place. And you can go play with the 5 patients left over. So I think it must be that we've got to also be very good advocates, that we've got to advocate that when people do not have the skills that are going to help these patients, then they shouldn't help them, but we shouldn't indulge them in these magnificent empires they built. They need, that money needs to move over with them too. And then we'll see frailty will become very respectable. The way that we do it where I work is, because we're still in the paper world there, but we just count the things that people have wrong with them. We have a one-page form called a comprehensive geriatric assessment. It's done on a tick box basis. I just spent the last week working in the emergency department as the internal medicine consultant. We saw everyone who came in over the age of 15, but everyone over the age of 65, we obliged one of these forms to be done. And people didn't say, oh, well, we got a geriatrician on this week, we better not send so many consults because it takes them so long. We've actually adapted, we've learned how to get all the information that we need in this way. And here's the key part of the information that we need. So on the form, it's structured in this way. There's bowels, bladder, nutrition, ADLs, IDLs, those sorts of things. And there's this amount of information, which is what the person was like 2 weeks ago, and this amount of information is what they're like right now, and they're structured in the same way. This is the line of independence, the line of intermediate dependence, the line of dependence. This is the good line, that's the bad line. You know, obviously they're not bad. But look, here's someone who right now, when we look at them right now this instant, they can't move in bed. They can barely move in bed. They're dependent in everything. If you let them to it, they'll wet themselves and worse. The question is, what was this person like 2 weeks ago? Was it that guy? Or was it that guy? Now, look at this guy. Thin, right? You can't tell by look, at least I can't tell. I've tried twice in a systematic way to evaluate an individual in bed, blind to anything about them, and see, can I simply tell from the physical characteristics of them how frail they were 2 weeks ago? And you can't. And particularly if this guy had something happen so he's a bit confused, what's he going to look like? Thin little guy there with his bum hanging out, lying on a stretcher with the hair, right? And particularly if he gets confused and can't give a history, we may not know that that guy just ran a marathon in 3 hours, 30 minutes. Probably what made him so confused. But this person will have a different outcome than that one will. And so as it turns out, this guy was independent 2 weeks ago, completely independent. What does this mean? It means he's very, very ill. and he's ill on his terms. And he didn't come in and say, "Doctor, I have crushing external chest pain right in my left arm and up into my jaw, and sense of impending doom, please help me. And by the way, take my white cell count, you'll see it's up, and the temperature will be up too, and my blood pressure will be a little bit soft." He won't do that. They'll get sick the only way they know how. And we have to interpret their illness. And this is the key of doing it. This is the key. Find out what they were like 2 weeks ago. So now we've got something, and I can give you an information theoretic perspective on this, which is mind-blowing. Notation goes on for a page and a half. But what I'm asking people to do, I'm asking people to take a history about function 2 weeks ago. And to our great shame, we can go through charts. I saw one of the posters last night. You go through, none of that information is there. We don't routinely collect that information. Every pill they've ever been on, every time they've had an allergy to codeine because they got constipated, we have all of that, but we don't have the information that we need. And here are data just come out now from some of the work we've done in China in a specialized geriatric ICU, and here were the outcomes. So this was the frailty index score pre-morbidly of the people who survived. They were basically all well. Here's the ones who died, and here's a cut point. No one above this cut point lived, and no one below that cut point died. Now, that's a perfect case. It worked out very well for reasons that we should learn from. But data from the Realistic 80s study that John and I were involved in that looked at the outcomes of people aged 80 years and older showed that the chance of being alive and having returned to function is about 1 in 5 if you're over the age of 80 when you come to the intensive care unit. And other things that were important out of that was the diagnosis that got them in, right? So it was bad to have a really bad illness, but after that it's what their functioning was like and what their frailty index was. And there are, another reason we should know this is because there are some areas in which frail people do better. It looks, interestingly enough, that hypertension is actually one of the areas in which the frail older adults do better than the ones who are fit. There are other areas in which people do less well, and that's really important to us because perhaps in this is not a signal to put them all in some other place. It's a signal to improve the care that we provide. So John Young, from whom you'll hear shortly, wrote a compelling paper with an uncompelling title called The Second National Audit of Intermediate Care. But the opening sentence of this is a call to arms for us, I think. It says, "The modern general hospital is complex, expensive, and has proved harmful to many people, and so simpler, cheaper, and safer alternatives have been sought, particularly for older people who are now the predominant users of health care. Simpler, cheaper, safer. That's what we need to be aiming for. And we need to know how to make it look simple while understanding that the reasoning behind what we do is actually complicated and sophisticated." There's also been a really good report called Making Health and Social Care Fit for an Aging Population. Free online, the Canadian Geriatrics Journal is an editorial from the chief editor of that and some comments from us about what the implications are for Canada. And I think this is actually worth us understanding. I've got 1 minute and 14 seconds left. It's also possible to get a frailty index based only on lab data. I won't talk more about that now. So to sum up, what I've said is that frailty is a multiply determined, reflects multiply determined risk. I believe it's a multiply determined risk state, greater than for others of the same age. It can be viewed as a state or as a syndrome, but however we do it, we're going to count health deficits. Therefore, we need to understand the basis by which health deficits arise. That's intrinsically bound up with aging. We have to understand the complexity of aging if we're going to make true headway, but for now, we have to have ways that allow us to embrace the complexity of frailty in older adults, and we have to be aware that much of what we need to learn and much of what we need to do sounds deceptively simple, and we need to have a way to communicate the simplicity in a way that doesn't overwhelm people, but also doesn't delude them into understanding the real nature of the challenge. And the picture pitch I would make here is that we need to make investments in aging from a quantitative standpoint if we're going to make the headway that we need to do to get to grips with this phenomenon. A great number of people have funded me over my time. A great number of people have collaborated with me. Some of them are here today. I thank all of them for their help and input, and I thank you for listening. Thank you very much.